So Josh, if I asked you right now, what is at risk this quarter, can you give me answer within like 60 seconds without opening a Slack?
What's at risk this quarter? Yes, I could probably do it within 10 seconds because we have everything on our Jira board where we have our company rocks boiled down to all of our tasks, and we look at them weekly, mark them at risk, and I could pretty much open them at any moment and get a real-time result of what's happening in the company right now.
So Grid.io implemented Jira for over like 30 companies just last quarter, which is huge and way above our goal. So after seeing so many setups for so many different teams, can you name one common operational blind spot that every CEO has before they see their business inside a structured system?
Yeah, I don't know if there's like one common blind spot for every company, but I think a lot of companies come into an implementation, they really don't think about the underlying way of work and process that their team uses to accomplish something. So a lot of times when an implementation happens within a tool, it's really just, hey, let's buy this new thing, let's set up whatever we need to get it running and call it a day. Rather than diving into understanding how does that work actually happen, what is the A to Z structure or the framework or the process that we use today that takes us from task is outstanding or needs to be done to task completed. And then how do we structure that in the best way possible inside of Jira, inside of whatever tool you're using to make that work as seamless, as frictionless as possible. That's something a lot of companies just don't really think about. Again, they kind of just throw whatever they have in there, call it a day and move on. And then eventually kind of comes back to haunt you later, and you have to rebuild, restructure, redo everything from the ground up. A lot of times when we do enter in engagement with a new company, it's to rebuild a process that they've built before that's just not working anymore. So they don't think about the scalability, the long-term impact, and what it'll do over the course of 5, 10 years maybe with the process that they're building now. They don't really think about the scalability aspect. So those are the couple of things that I've noticed most often.
So most of those companies that you talked about, they weren't starting from scratch, right? They migrated from other systems like Asana, ClickUp, Monday, or even just spreadsheets, which is quite crazy. So the question is, at what point it clicked for them that it wasn't a tool problem, but rather the way work was set up for them and how the work was flowing between teams?
I think they realize when we start our discovery process, because we don't go into an engagement and just say, great, what does it look like in Asana? Let's go ahead and just replicate this in Jira or whatever other tool that you might be migrating to. We have a pretty rigorous and in-depth requirements gathering and discovery process, POC building process. And I think at that point, it starts to click that it's not really the way a tool is built or used. It's really not the tool itself. It's really the way that it's been structured or implemented for the team. Now, there are some pros and cons to every tool. Some work better than others for some use cases, for some teams, for some groups. So there are advantages and disadvantages to having some teams in like Asana, for example, which is very marketing friendly, versus an engineering team, which would probably hate to use Asana. So a lot of times when we start this discovery process, the team that we work with, the company that we're engaging with, it clicks for them that this is much deeper and more rudimentary to the system, the culture, the way of work, the maybe even bad habits, maybe good habits that were being used before, that were being done before in a previous tool. And we're trying to work through that and build a better way in the next implementation. Because you can take whatever's in your current tool and just go straight into Jira, do one-for-one mapping. For the most part, you can do that with most tools, but you're pretty much taking everything that was bad about your old process and putting it into a new place in a slightly different way. And you're bringing over all that baggage, all of those issues that you had before, and thinking that maybe the tool will just function better, save us in the long run. But that can't be further from the truth, because if you're bringing everything as a one-for-one from another tool into Jira, into anything else, you're bringing all those problems with you. And what we do is we take a pause in between that, and we do that requirements gathering, we do that discovery process, We do build out POCs, make recommendations, do a full delivery, and then we go into implementation. I think during somewhere right in that moment when we're wrapping up requirements gathering and building those POCs is where the click really happens for most of the companies.
So you work with a lot of non-technical teams, and what do you think, why so many of them is so afraid of complexity when in reality it's actually the lack of the structure that is killing their productivity and their everyday workflows?
Yeah, complexity isn't bad. I think a lot of people frame friction or the ability to do something or the customization, the flexibility options as complexity. But what the complexity really is when you have all those options available to you and you put all of them into one system, one way of work, one workflow, and you're adding so many points of friction, and then you look at that and you say, why is this so complex, so hard to manage, so hard to take a task from to do to done? Whereas the complexity of the tool allows you to do a lot of things, like have a very intricate change management workflow with multiple approval steps, things of that nature, where you can actually do that in Jira, whereas a lot of tools don't quite have the richness and the features to allow you to do something more complex. But a lot of people and a lot of teams, a lot of companies, they look at that and they just think, how much can we pull into this workflow? What is the maximum we could do? What is the most information we could collect and gather in this process, whether that's on intake or during the workflow sometime? And that creates a lot of confusion, that creates a lot of bureaucracy, it creates a lot of friction, and a lot of the teams that use these workflows then start to hate the tool. And again, it's just because it is possible doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. So a lot of these teams go into it, they start using it, they start moving tasks over to in progress, they get field requirements that they have to fill out every single time. Then they close a ticket, they get more field requirements. To open a ticket, they have to fill out like 10 fields. And then you have this workflow built, this project built for a specific team or company, and everybody just hates it. And the reason is because the things that you've pulled into that workflow, that project, didn't probably need to be there. Just because it's available to you doesn't mean you need to absolutely pull in every possible thing and require every possible field. So the complexity of the tool is like a pro and a con, because you can do a lot of things really well, but you could also do a lot of things very wrong, and you kind of end up getting pulled into one direction or the other, and a lot of teams end up stumbling into like the overly complex type of workflow where they just didn't take a simplistic approach to what they were doing and didn't think about the end user, and as a result, they created a system that doesn't really benefit or care to sort of make it simple and easy and frictionless for the end users to actually work. And that's kind of what we try to do differently. We try to make it simple, easy, and actually fun to use.
And speaking of non-technical teams, and I'm asking there from non-technical perspective myself, that's why I'm curious, what kind of different departments have you worked with and you saw the successful Jira implementation? Yeah,
I mean, it's probably every team at this point. There hasn't really been a team we haven't worked with to implement a Jira work management board in. And I think a lot of that is because companies that do use Jira, especially on the slightly smaller size, maybe between 10 and 100 employees, they really like the idea of having one tool that could do all of their work tracking. And that becomes very difficult if you're using a tool like Asana or ClickUp when you have a very large, let's say, software team. And really there's only a couple of decent software tools out there, Jira being one of them, for software development teams. So when you go to Jira, you actually have the capability to do very complex software work management. You could do general project management, task management, service management is a really big piece of Jira as well. So you have the capability to use these tools that are not only great at doing general work management, but are very specialized to very specialized teams, and allow you to use one tool for everything without kind of going outside of it. With Confluence, with the rest of the Atlassian suite, I think it's a really great, it's a really good opportunity to use something that not only smaller teams currently use, but Jira is used in enterprise environments and it works really well and it scales really well from smaller to larger teams. So I think the opportunity is incredible to just pull everything under one roof And a lot of the companies we work with tend to do that. We make that recommendation, just kind of put it on the table. And a lot of companies really like that idea of just having one place they could go, see every single task, every single project, every initiative, everything that they're working on from one single view. And because of that, we end up working with every single team to kind of build them solutions in Jira. And there hasn't been a team that we've worked with where we've said, this just straight up does not work. There are certain moments where we're like, this is not the best use case for Jira. A CRM is a good example of that. But for every department and team, in terms of work management, project management, task management, Jira is a really great solution for that.
Okay, and now let's talk about scaling. So I'm curious, at what team size does the process that is simple and intuitive is actually turning into something that the team has completely outgrown already?
I think it depends on how you implement it initially. There's ways where you can build a really great starting point for a team of two, for example, in Jira. We're working with a team of literally 2 people, a company of 2 people to implement Jira right now. And we will build out a system for them that's easily going to grow to probably a few hundred. And we're creating it and making it scalable as we're actually implementing the tool. Now, there's certain things that will probably need to be changed, shifted, reworked, and that's going to happen at any size, any company size. Because your customers change, your requests change, your work changes, the nature of what you do sort of gets a little bit more unique and different as your company grows. So there are absolutely things that have to be tweaked, but fundamentally, if you do implement a solution, a process, whatever it is inside of Jira or really any other tool correctly, it should be able to scale with you almost infinitely with changes along the way. But at the very least, you don't have to kind of go back to the drawing board and start from scratch, which is what we do with a lot of companies, because their foundation is just not a scalable one. And that's kind of the most important thing when you do start implementing, to build a really good scalable long-term foundation. Think of, if I'm implementing this for a team of 10, will this still work for a team of 1,000? If the answer is no, you might want to go back to the drawing board and rework a few things. So that's really the goal of what we try to do. Most of the time when we do engage with companies, I would say 80% of the time it's like a ground up rebuild, because they're oftentimes migrating from different tools and they kind of did that one-for-one migration versus kind of rebuilding in that moment. They have sort of just implemented a tool. This is very common, and the company grew and they've just started adding and pulling stuff in randomly, adding new workflows, new request types, building something that they don't really recognize anymore because they didn't have the time and effort to dedicate into building a really good process from the ground up. They've just kind of implemented what was a good solution for them at that moment, and then they started pulling things in over time, which is very, very common. Hard to blame those companies because there's a lot of things happening when companies grow and a lot of other higher priority things that you can focus on. But I would say most of the time we work with companies to rebuild, but there's absolutely a way to implement projects, to implement work in a way that is ultimately very scalable and can help you to pretty much avoid those future rebuilds entirely.
And is it actually easier to start from scratch, or is it easier to actually rebuild those processes while the company is in this phase of scaling?
Yeah, it really depends. And that's a call we typically make when we actually start working with a client. We'll do the requirements gathering, the Jira strategy portion. We'll look at what they have today. That's the first part of what we do. We do the requirements gathering sessions, dive into audit what they have today. And then when we provide feedback and recommendations, we'll either say, let's rebuild this from the ground up, or let's just build on top of what we have and rework it a little bit. I would say 80% of the time, again, we do rebuild. I think it's generally easier just to say, especially if you feel like you've dug yourself a hole and it'd be very difficult to dig yourself out, just start from scratch. And what we usually do is keep everything as is, keep everything running the way it is. And in a sandbox or in a new project, just start building things from the ground up. And then once you're ready, have a go live date and a cutover date where you move everything over, you shift over. Let's say it's a Monday, and on that go live date, you move over to the new system. That way there's no downtime and no problems, and it really gives you that time to plan, test, and be able to implement something that you actually want to be using, that's a better solution without breaking anything in the meantime.
So you mentioned before about value of having everything in one place. So how much operational drag is created when a leader or project manager has to jump between, 5 different tools just to get a pulse of the single project?
It depends on the role. So I think it becomes exponentially more valuable the higher up the role is. So if you take like a junior individual who's, let's say, like a junior engineer or someone on the team who's doing some kind of admin work, and if that individual has to switch between Jira and Asana and Google Docs, Google Spreadsheets, and a few different tools to actually be able to get the context they need to accomplish a project or task or do their work, they may be losing an hour-ish a day, maybe half an hour if they're pretty efficient, maybe 20 minutes, maybe a couple hours in some cases. And that time isn't super valuable, but it is very valuable the higher up you go. So if you go to like a senior developer, a COO, a CEO, and in those moments when you're trying to get context on what project is currently in progress, where do we have our current blockers? What is at risk right now? And you really can't even get an accurate result without looking at every single tool individually, every single project that's running. And because every single tool is different, you have to sort of understand how each of them works, make sure that you're kind of thinking in terms of how does Asana work, how does Jira work, how does Google Sheets work, Google Docs, and trying to interpret those results to making a good decision. And making a bad decision as a CEO and trying to figure out all this information and looking across a bunch of different platforms is extremely valuable. And it loses a lot of time. It loses a lot of competitive edge because you can't just look at one singular place and make a really good decision. So for pretty much everybody in the company, it creates some kind of operational drag and creates some kind of problems where it just takes longer to get something done. But the higher up you go, the more problems it creates. And a lot of times that's why companies approach working with us, because they are in that moment where they have each team lives in their own tool, just because that's how they've structured it. They didn't have any policy in place previously, and they're at the point where they don't know what to do because there's no singular place for reporting. They can't pull clean metrics. Every single workflow is built differently, and they just want one singular place where they can track work, manage projects, and get good reporting. So definitely creates a lot of problems, especially the larger the company and the more senior the role.
Okay, so let's talk money. What's more expensive, investing in a bit of structure right now or ripping out a broken system 2 years down the road?
It's more expensive to rip out the entire system later, and not because it might cost a lot to hire a team or good people to actually help you implement something like that, but more because not only does it take time away from your team during that moment when you're recreating those processes, but during, let's say, those full 2 years, you're less efficient than you could have been. So a lot of people think about the cost of, okay, we'll rebuild this later. We'll put the money, towards something later when we engage with an organization to help us do this, or hire to do it internally, or just do it with our current resources. They don't think about the cost that they're losing in the meantime, or the kind of the sunk costs that they're potentially going to be seeing over the next several years. So you might be saying, okay, we don't have a good place to track our goals, our metrics, our projects. We are able to do it, but maybe it takes 10, 15 hours a week to be able to cobble this all together into one weekly report for the whole company. So that's a lot of time and a lot of money over the course of those several years. And a lot of people just don't take that into consideration. They just assume, we have the team to do it. If we need to hire someone else, we can do it. And the cost is essentially the cost of implementation. But you kind of miss the opportunity cost, which does end up being fairly large. And if your goal is 2 years, it's probably going to be 4 or 5 years. So the timeline is always going to grow larger. I know every time we approach a project, we think we're going to do it in X amount of time, and it usually ends up being pushed back, prioritized lower when we have bigger things coming up. So that opportunity cost is definitely the biggest element.
Mm-hmm. Now I have one more specific question about the implementation itself. So what's one of the specific process that you've seen go from 100 of manual coordination to being fully automated? Do you can name something like that? The process that you actually saw automated in 100%? And if yes, what did this unlock for the leadership and the teams?
Yeah, the biggest process, there's two processes that I've seen that have really been almost all automated to the max. And what I mean to the max is like almost no human interaction. So the two processes that I've seen are client onboarding and onboarding for end users and offboarding for end users. So I'm kind of bundling the onboarding, offboarding for end users and for clients. There are others. These are probably the more hands-off and automated ones because they're so structured. Whenever you onboard a new employee or a client, you have a very specific set of actions to follow, steps to take, requirements, tasks to complete. A lot of that can not only be organized with automation, but also essentially taken action by automation. Some examples for that, for us, for example, when we onboard a new client, what we do is we run an automation that creates a new Jira project, creates a new Jira space, creates Jira tasks of what we need to accomplish for that new client, sends out automated emails, creates a Confluence space with all the individuals' details, essentially, the user's information, their preferred communication methods, their time zone, like everything about the individual that we would need to know when we actually do the kickoff. So we automated that process almost 100%. I think we're like 90-ish% at this point. So there's very little human interaction for us, but we've made it automated in a way where it does feel like there is a very personal touch to it. And it's pretty much what we took from what we were doing in a fully manual process. And we just took each element of that step and thought about how we could best automate it and not really need to action on it whatsoever. Same thing with onboarding of employees. You could really look at that and say, okay, we have to create this account. Can we automate this account creation? 99% of the time it's a yes, we can. For Slack, for email accounts, for whatever it is, you could automate a lot of that. Same thing with offboarding. There are sometimes elements that you cannot automate, which, a little bit of a bummer, but you can get very close to a one-click automation for client onboarding, offboarding, and sort of similar types of processes where everything is very structured, very specific, and has a very clear outline of steps A to Z. And then you could kind of look at each of those steps and think about the most creative ways to automate them.
Wow, yeah, that's actually sounds really awesome. Okay, so my next question is about something that I think that everyone has experienced at least once within the career. So micromanagement is such a common struggle for CEOs and also for teams, of course. We know how frustrating it can be. So how can a leader track risks in a real time with work management tools without constantly nudging people for updates and without those micromanaging habits?
Yeah, micromanagement is a direct response to just not having information on what's currently happening. So a CEO who has a project that's currently being worked on, who has a team that's working on something, the only time there needs to be micromanagement there, or the only time that ends up happening, is if the CEO doesn't know what's going on, or the leader, the IT director, the engineering director, marketing director, the manager, whoever that leader is. The only reason there is room for micromanagement is if the systems are not in place to give them good context and information on what's currently happening. So if you solve for that problem, you're able to provide your leaders, your managers with that context, the need for micromanagement kind of disappears. Because as long as there's results, as long as there's progress and things are being accomplished, the leadership is typically going to be happy. There are moments where it's like cultural and problematic, but I would say that's lesser common. And it's more common that there's just no good system implemented that allows leaders to see what's currently happening. And a lot of this is cultural because you can implement the best process in the world. But if your team doesn't use that process to update tasks, to update the information, keep things relevant, then it's no good. You could, again, have the best version of a project management platform, project management tool in the world. And if nobody uses it, it's completely irrelevant. So a lot of it is cultural, making sure that the team is excited to put in their information, to create their tasks. Incentivizing your team is a really great way to do that as well. give them some kind of a bonus or something. If they're keeping up to date within a certain time frame, for example, that's a really good method. But creating good systems and processes, creating a good culture around, we don't actually need to micromanage or even ask what's happening over Slack ever, or in person, or verbally, or over email. Everything that we need to get context on is in our work management tool or in some kind of a report. That's kind of the direction I would lean in. And again, I've worked with a lot of companies and I've been in some micromanagement situations. Every single time it boils down to just not having enough context and information to what's happening. And the question really becomes, how do you actually solve for that? So that's one thing that I would definitely focus on.
Let's go back to the money topic once again. So when companies look at the price of a tool, of a software, they often miss the bigger picture, right? How do software costs compare to the cost of coordination overhead? Like endless meetings, no structure at all, changing tool every single quarter and reworking everything from scratch once again.
I think the work management tool costs are very cheap in the context of a business. It's probably 1% of revenue, maybe a little bit more for most companies. Usually the bulk of revenue, or the biggest cut for every company, goes to employees and the team and the people. So when you look at rework, at things that need to be done twice, things that can potentially be automated, any kind of data entry, essentially, that really eats into majority of the cost, because most of your cost is people. And when people are not doing the work that you're hiring them to do, that ends up costing you more. For example, if you need to build a report once a week, let's say, and your data lives in a bunch of different places and you need to aggregate all that data and it takes 15, 20 hours a week to do that. Why would you spend 20 hours a week trying to aggregate all that data when you could build a solution that does that for you? And then you free up those 20 hours for that individual to actually focus on higher leverage things. So most of our solution to problems like this, and a lot of company solutions, is to hire more people, either low-level people to accomplish those data entry tasks, higher-level people to help split that workload, where I think the better approach is to see if we can create a solution that doesn't actually require that task to happen at all. And we're seeing that happen a lot with AI right now. That's kind of a big factor and tool that we can utilize. I think it could do a lot, especially on the data entry, the kind of lower level tasks, the little things that need to get accomplished, the context that needs to be added. AI can do a lot of that. Same thing with automation, same thing with just the process and system and tool that you're using. Focus on taking those things that you did not hire someone to do, like data entry, like creating reports or whatnot, and try to eliminate that from being done altogether. Try to focus on that problem once, put a little bit of effort into it so that it's resolved forever. So bulk of the cost is definitely on the people side and not the software side.
We talked about the biggest struggle, one of the most common biggest struggle of teams and CEOs, but now let's talk fears. I believe that one of the biggest fear for every CEOs and for every business owner is actually a downtime. So how do you overhaul a company's entire operating system without freezing their operational for 60, 90 days?
Yeah, so typical project implementation for us tends to be, 1 to 3 months, somewhere in that range. And we never work on the project in a real production environment if there are major things that are being done actively, like an engineering team is working, a product is being run, customer support is being provided. You never want to work in that production environment. So build in a sandbox, build in a place where you can create the solution and test the solution, run some UAT on it, iterate on it, and then have a go live. That's kind of the most common way to do it. There have been moments where we have come in and there is a good foundation. We're kind of making more nice to have changes and improvements. In those moments where we can make those changes and they won't have a major impact, it'll be very minor. If something does go wrong at the very least, then we are okay with working in that production environment because it won't take anything down. But if it does bring something down, or if it's a fundamental rework, then we go into a sandbox environment.
Okay, Josh, so thinking about all of the answers that you gave me, the work management system seems pretty robust solution for everybody. So why do teams still resist for this structure so much? Like, I hate the Jira sentence. I think it's common in every single organization. And do you think it is like from bad memories, from the previous tools, or its lack of onboarding? So my question here is, how do you actually get those teams to like the system, to use the system without forcing compliance?
Yeah, so the second part is the most important because a lot of companies hate the tool that they use. A lot of teams hate the tool that they use, and they're forced to be compliant. And that's what really makes them hate it, because they are using a solution that is not optimal, a solution that creates a lot of friction for their work, creates a lot of barriers, complexity, and then they're being forced to use it. And then they absolutely hate it. And that's where we see all the Jira hate come from, because all of these solutions are oftentimes built in a very non-ideal way. And then companies say you absolutely have to do this and use this, and then the team hates it. So I would focus on building a solution that the teams love. Now, what do I mean by this? Building a solution that teams love makes it really easy to create something, to move it through the workflow, and then to complete it. So if, for example, you have 10 fields that you need context on, when you're getting a work item that's already completed, like by the end of the workflow, you need 10 required fields for future reporting. Rather than adding in 2 required fields in a screen per each workflow change, because then every single time you jump in and pretty much take any single action, you get a screen that pops up that says, hey, we need this context or information. I would reevaluate what information you actually need, because a lot of times companies require information that they do not need, that they think they do. And when we really get down to it, I end up asking them, is this something you're actually reporting on currently? If the answer is no, then we just get rid of it altogether. Usually you could get rid of 50% of the fields doing just that. And then I would suggest bundling all of the requirements into the back half of the workflow. That way you can create and kind of get a good trajectory, or get on the roll of actually working through a task, and then add any requirements down the road. The worst, I think, is when you stack a ton of required fields on creation, because that really kills the motivation for someone to actually create a work item. And sometimes you just can't get around this, like a service management like portal or customer support request. In those scenarios, I try to make it as simple as possible with conditional logic, least amount of required fields, very simple and easy to fill out fields. But with work management style boards, where it's like a task tracking or engineering team backlog or something along those lines, I try to make it as simple as possible to create a work item and get the progress and momentum going on it, and then require context information later if you need to, and bundle it as much as you can. That way every single transition doesn't require something. It's only, let's say, on 1 or 2 transitions that you're actually required to input information. And at that point, work becomes much more enjoyable, because you can actually feel like you're jumping in and getting something done without being blocked and stopped every single time that you try to make some sort of a change. So make that enjoyable, make it easy, put yourself in the shoes of someone who's using that process every single day, and try to encourage them to add context and information. Try to build that culture rather than adding those restrictions and requirements just because you can.
Okay, and here goes my last question. What's the real advantage of companies that get their work management system right today versus the one who decide to wait another 12 months?
There's a lot of advantage to doing it today. And a lot of companies that we kind of engage with initially or have conversations with, when they approach us, they might be saying, this actually happens a lot more often than you would think. They say that they have higher priorities and initiatives and things to work on before they could approach a project like this. They're kind of just getting the conversation started. And they're too busy to work on a initiative like this because there's higher priority things and a list of backlog items to work through. And I like to challenge that, because a lot of times what we can implement in 1 to 3 months will easily save you half a year, because we can actually prioritize tasks well. We can report on tasks well, make decisions better. By the time you get to month 12, your priorities probably shifted like 3 or 4 times. in terms of like the highest priority work to actually work on, especially in a smaller company that shifts very, very quickly. And if you don't have the solution and the platform and the sort of underlying foundation to support a really good decision, to support really good priorities of work, you end up doing things that may not be relevant 12 months from now. And you would have been better off just creating a really good system and process today and taking a month or two to do that to set yourself up for the next 12. And by the time that you do that and fix everything that you have, you could really get up and running and have really clear goals, action items, projects, tasks for teams, really great reporting, be able to pivot really quick, make great decisions. You'll be way, way further ahead than someone who's done this 12 months later, who's only then realizing that we should have done this earlier. And most of the time when we do engage a company that kind of does hold off for a while and they start it, we wrap up the implementation, then they say, we should have done this earlier. Like this would have definitely helped us during this busy season. It's usually not, usually they come to us saying we're too busy to do this, but the kind of result of what they're doing is it ends up being that they're too busy because they're not doing this. So it kind of turns it around a little bit, and it's ultimately going to be in the long run a net positive if they have a really good foundation solution for work than if they defer it to later, because not only will you keep deferring it and high priority tasks keep coming up, but you don't really have a good long-term way of actually creating priorities, managing work, and managing goals and company-related initiatives.